Hello everyone, I have time today for a quick question and answer video. Given that I had some technical problems, I lost a good hour, but I will dedicate the necessary amount of time to a question that is an evergreen, right? And I simply read it under my medieval Western Balkan warfare video. So randomly, can you recommend any books on medieval history as a whole? I want a starting point and I'll see where to go from there. So I will be answering now, likely not being that sort of read this or that specifically, because I wanna. First of all, I've already answered this question. If you check my Historian playlist, where I usually make this sort of more theoretical insight, let's say on history, philosophy, etc. I answered this specifically. What kind of book do you recommend to know? I don't remember the title, whether it's about medieval history specifically or what books I recommend in general. There's really lots of stuff on it. I answer again this question because you know that I don't say people make a lot of questions, but for different reasons I hardly ever answer. All right, and at some point we'll pass to that because the channel is starting to be large enough to have at this point, let's say, I don't think that the moral obligation to answer, but let's say at least there is an important amount of traffic that derives from that curiosity that at some point I have to satisfy them in some ways. I will answer this question specifically by updating a bit, of course, also my views over time. We grow up, hopefully, or we come up with sort of different insight, etc. And this is, say, a question that I want to understand. I'm not going to answer, say, specifically. Maybe I don't think I'm going to make necessarily another video, but I want to know this person's background. It's the first thing that I do whenever I answer these questions, right? Because I'm habituated to do so. I look at people, say, straight in the face professionally. I want to know. I want to understand the sort of the sensible matter behind that. And here, just from the nickname, I have Mr. Valois. VAIOS. 1996. So I guess this guy is at this point like 27, etc. And it's relatable. This is just my conjecture, of course, on the basis of the nickname. But it's not the first time I say meet with people like they're in the second half of their 20s or even older that you understand that they have surely gone through some thing in their lives. They have another job, I presume. They don't study history, nor they plan to work with history as a living, but they have a genuine interest in that. And that's something where we all start from. I mean, even for someone that did this for a living, of course, I understand the feeling because it's exactly the same one. Everybody is at the beginning. Right, and there may be different reasons why people want to know this, and so I will try to calibrate the answer on the basis of what I think it's sort of the best dose, sort of prescription, recipe, and so on. I will skip also any other assumption regarding, I don't know, why this person commented this video, what kind of interest can there be, etc. I just like I want a starting point and I'll see where to go from there, because it is so it's not like those people who whine for give me the sources for this video, or I don't know where did you hear this, or etc. It's something like I want to go on my own with this, and I want to dig and see whether my life changes or whatever or not. And I think this is a very productive attitude, but at the same time it's a double-edged sword that we must be aware of in this function, because of course you may not achieve a level of historical awareness that is necessarily the right one and satisfactory. So my first say idea here is um, what do we want to do, right? How far are you willing to go with historical knowledge? If the question is just any book recommendation, I can tell you that I don't really have, for not just for books on medieval history as my discipline, etc., but some proper favorites in my life. I don't, and I would never tell someone, look at that scholar and follow him, right? Unless, of course, he's the only, I'd say, the leading expert in the field, and it's a very specific, say, thematic choice, and so on. So I will say essentially how I went from the beginning, and how I began to develop also an autonomous interest in different authors and why. All right. So the first advice as far as medieval history as a whole is concerned is picking, it may be a banal answer, but a very good manual, which, however, is perhaps at this point, especially in history, one of the most difficult things to achieve. Right? I've given a read to a consistent number of manuals, both from my country and abroad. I realized that there is a sort of, especially in the say in the Anglosphere, tendency to make things a bit more theoretical and sort of schematic and even theoretical to some degree, to the point of let's try to answer the question, what is the Middle Ages? And those are kind of interesting things, right? But when it also gets down to focusing on, let's say, the single medieval history issues, right? As such, my question, my first concern, and also just to answer specifically the question, is I want to have a manual that literally gives me a whole picture of the Middle Ages in some evidential depth, right? And I'm not sure there is a true manual that at least satisfies my interest in that regard. I believe that the Middle Ages specifically, like if you study Roman history, for example, more or less, yes, you need to know a lot about, I don't know, Hellenistic history before. You need to have a sort of good idea of this other 20 peoples, kingdoms, culture, etc., that gravitated around the Mediterranean. But fundamentally, you're going to stick to Roman history more or less. You're going always to read about the same thing. The problem with the Middle Ages, and the thing that for which I actually wanted to study ancient history at the beginning, but to make a long story short, there wasn't a curriculum in my university. Which, I'm not going to disclose this thing, but it's not because my university actually was backwards in that regard, and the reason is shocking exactly for it. And the centrality of the topic as well. But one of my legitimate interests in medieval history since the beginning, say high school, etc., was sort of the complexity of the period, right? The fact that, again, while with antiquity more or less you stick around one empire, one major people, etc., with medieval history you're forced to study, essentially, if you want to know it well, the history of every single damn polity that existed at the time, right? And when you try to elude that, it becomes, I think, more of a joke rather than a proper medieval history learning, right? And this thing of, say, picking every country, like you start with England, then you pass to France and Germany, etc. You rarely have really any text that deals with that in some depth, right? My predilected choice for a good medieval history manual is looking at continental European ones from, let's say, immediately after the Second World War, and of course not the Marxist ones, because until 1968 it was some decency about this. There were, of course, this. Don't get me wrong, they were structuralistically dominated historiographies, right, already. But the guys that were writing at the time, these manuals, were also the former pupils of the idealists. So you have very peculiar combinations of, let's say, this person knew what evenemential sort of the histoire bataille, etc., idealistic, spiritual, religious history were about. Also because you could have structuralists, but that had also been brought up in a properly Christian background and education, were very often influenced by that. So they had an idea of what the Middle Ages was, also from a spiritual point of view. Right. For that, I always advise pick at least a history of religion manuals. Right, the ones they use it the first year. And I presume I think I've never really read manuals outside this sort of older continental background. I don't want to even know, frankly, what manuals of history of religions are used today, because I suspect they are, especially again in this, in the Anglosphere, heavily biased towards a completely rigged interpretation, but not because maybe they're even good manuals themselves, but they just don't focus on things that concretely matter, right? I studied on a horrifying manual that was also structuralistic and was trying essentially not to see the unifying characteristic, but the categoristic, in fact, structuralistic sense of this religion is that, this is that, it's classified in this way. This is already bad in itself, but at least something that gives you the ABC of what history of religion is. Then something properly about Christian history is necessary as well. Even about this, I studied some works on Augustine, Paul, Luther, but let's say just because in those university classes we had those as a program, and they were okay. All right. I studied the Circumcellions, late antique heresies, or stuff like that. So I can't even say it, because when normally this stuff is taught more in depth, aside from the basic manuals in master classes, etc. But say among my various degrees, there is one title somewhere that is history of religions in it. So I perhaps had a bit slightly more religious background than others. Speaking of the university curriculum, but those are, in my opinion, ultra necessary. Right? It's incredibly dangerous to start studying any era without understanding the spiritual background of the same. Right, and especially the Middle Ages, not because the ancient world was less spiritual in the Middle Ages, but because at least those who are aware of medieval religiosity, tend to be closer to the originally sort of spiritual, even idealistic historiography that took care of this, right? It's very difficult to do so in the Anglosphere, because as far as I've seen, there is it's never about the theology of it. It's never about the actual belief. It's how monasteries were organized, how what was the political deal of the investiture controversy. But when it gets down to what did actually these people believe, at that point you should go among the mystics, right? Even of the ones of the 21st century, even certain figures that, if you mention, are somehow, the black sheep of the situation because of political reasons, etc. But just be aware that there is all a study of tradition and of religion that you can approach. And it's, I'm digressing here, but I can't stress enough how important it is, at least to predispose yourself towards the necessity of a thorough Christian history education in order to study the Middle Ages. It should be just something you do in parallel. If you come from, I don't know, in high school you were lucky enough to have, like me by the way, a very good history of philosophy curriculum, which is not that frequent as far as I know. It's something we do here specifically, and I think I was lucky specifically just because of the of the professors that I had, etc. But if you have in your teenage been toying with that sort of existential issues, you got interested in religion, in Christianity throughout the eras, etc. Well, that's sort of easier, right? It projects you towards a world you can understand some paradigms of. There are some, for example, there is an Italian medieval history manual by an author called Giovanni Tabacco that is just about the early High Middle Ages, right? And I think the other part was done by another guy who was a pupil of his, and that was more structuralistically oriented. So you have later Middle Ages told more from a social, economical perspective. I think that's terrible, but at least, right, in that case, I use this as a title of example because there's plenty of authors, right? Tabacco is quite famous in continental historiography, but just to give for that first part, like a bit of an idea of what a medieval history manual should be, right? A guy that, like the professors back in the day, right in the 50s and the 60s, were dramatically better educated. Like they had this sort of learning deeply imbued, even just from a familiar background, from the necessity of a spiritual interest, some with deep literary references. And in that specific case, taking every single major issue that you may not, if you're not familiar with medieval history, it's some that you may have not even thought that it was a thing. And when you start especially studying these things, you say, what the hell that is supposed to be? And realizing that the guy had literally absorbed say, at least at the time it was easier, right, to read what was written at the time. Today it would be prohibitive, right? But having gotten at least the basics of that issue historiographically, and in a time in which, however, the basics of the historical core, aside from the various historiographical interpretations, eventually arose and tend to revisit these ideas and so on, is really a matter of culture that does not exist anymore, right? There is today, again, there is a proliferation of publications that is terrifying, because even if you make a PhD, you realize that you should realistically spend the entire doctorate just on the covering the historiography, right? Making a premise on the topic rather than talking about the topic itself, because there is so much that if you wanted to be sure that literally everything has been ever said, and it's a quite complex thing to study over the years before you fully absorb and mature, etc., you wouldn't be able to carry out even an original research, right? At least if you are obsessed with sort of, okay, I missed something out, right? And I had started that PhD series that for some reason people did not watch, and I honestly think that we should come back on it, if anything, to show methodologically how things work. But the point being that you can, say, fall in love with the mere wisdom of people that lived just a couple of generations ago, and that had literally absorbed the entirety of the medieval historiography of the time. How did these people study and learn? I don't know. I think they had dramatically better trained memory than our own, but it's also about their social, cultural background. These were the good people that had studied hard, that had, I don't know, big libraries, that had time to deepen their knowledge, that they came from highly educated families and so on. And the first time you read such a manual or a similar one, the impression, especially if you don't have a progressed historical awareness, you just still wondering, what were actually the various the correct order of the various dominations in a certain European country or another, well, you may not appreciate to the fullest, like, because a manual like this, first of all, is very difficult to find, and so likely most of what you're able to get today is really not even answering any of the questions. And so there is this attitude that is, I want everything soon and quick, right? Which I personally detest in general, and that's also why I provide with this sort of strange answers in the way at least I provide them, because you could say, well, just give me the titles, right? And then it doesn't work like that, right? One should go in parallel. You could read a manual like this, and then read something else in the meanwhile, or liking one specific. And the interesting thing about manuals, banally, is that they have a bibliography. People, again, I made multiple videos at this point explaining why I don't, for say, if I make a video, I can't quote, I don't know, a couple of sources, a couple of scholars, but it's obvious that if I talk for 1 hour and a half on a topic like, I don't know, the Merovingians, etc., it's obvious that I can't even begin to provide you with all the actual bibliography, because these are things that I'm formulating in my mind, and even when I find some other information, that's an open information, right? You can easily check it even on Google, and of course you could say, do you do that from there? No, I do it from my sources, but they are things you can easily find confirmed out there. The problem is that without having those books and those and that background, and especially by simply being able to make 2 + 2, which is exactly what history at the end of the day is supposed to be, right? If I give a bibliography, do you think that any, say, person is capable of picking this and applying it, finding the answers to that? No. Well, you don't even begin with that, because I may have read, I don't even know how many hundreds of books, but it's obvious that all of that is something that reemerges from the within whenever a speaker thinks history, because of all those suggestions and ideas and sort of things that eventually reconfirm themselves step by step. And this is a mechanism that you can afford to do only after you have spent at least a good, 10 years studying medieval history, and seriously. So not like most universities do, when you just, again, read basically these basic manuals that don't tell you anything. They project you immediately into a sort of very niche topic for the more advanced studies. They don't actually teach you how to quote or to broaden your own sort of bibliographical background, because the professors stop just to that, say to that topic that they want to propose you, because it's the one they actually care and occupy themselves with. And so even after years of university training, you're going to simply remain ignorant, right, as far as history really is, right? I must say that I started Schwerpunkt when I started my doctorate back in the day, and I realized that the level of learning that all this everyday video making, together with the explanation, the research, and so on, has basically been as important, even though in different ways, as my research, right? If one starts from the assumption that it's enough just to read a book to get the answer, has already failed, right? Has already, like, where did you get this information from, without understanding that you have 200 information in your mind, and that it's, you should be glad that somebody that has gone through this journey provides you with that sort of insight, rather than with the actual quote or citation that's the measure that the person understands perfectly that you don't have any actual historical background on your own, right? And even if you have, it's of the sort of contemporary sloppy type that thinks literally that history is something that is being engraved somewhere, and that if you cite or quote, is going to give the answer to the person who reads that, right? Without understanding that it's always a matter of authority, because it's always passing down mechanically then what quotes, the citations, and what for, right? That's something that untrained people that need to learn, that need to get educated, even in the actual research do. Then at some point you step further, and you are the one who makes the research and starts reasoning on, given that experience, on the actual quality of somebody else's research. And so if you want to say that research is wrong for some reason, you're allowed to say that, and you're allowed to criticize it, even in ways that, especially if you are on YouTube, you're simply devoid of responsibility in terms of providing the actual demonstration. And it's something that makes me, if you want, otherwise you can't do it. But that's the thing that strikes me the most to this very day, from the YouTube thing, right? That nobody makes any video about the topics I make, and for some reason, which I never see on any other channel, people seem to be obsessed with the sources, right? From one side, it can be flattering, as if, of course, oh my God, he's telling this, so I want to know that too, because I can definitely profit from it myself. But this is exactly the point, and part of the reason which I have absolutely no interest in debating these topics. In order to learn history, you must study it on your own. You can't even just read it or cite it, right? You must do the freaking work. So that's why I think that whenever here he says, I want a starting point there, starting from there. Okay, so be aware, first of all, you must fall back always on a reliable set of information, even of basic dates and names. Let's erase, of course, any doubt on the necessity of evenemential history. Whoever thinks that history is not about dates and names is just an idiot, right? It's not that there aren't just dates and names, but if you don't even know that, you can't know anything else, right? That is propedeutic to the concept, because you can learn the concept as well on your own, but if you can't fix this in time and in space, and you literally have no idea of how these topics actually glue themselves together, you're just essentially, you're not learning, say, what happened. You're learning at that point really somebody else's opinion that even though is a big name that you can cite, doesn't actually provide you with the capacity of reading what really happened. And in fact, this is somehow terrifying just to acknowledge for a professional. Very often we start well in terms of when you're very young, you want to know everything, right? And then you go to university and you're given this sort of pieces of categories of skeletons, etc., that are needed at the time as well, in part to debunk what you already learned, or to distinguish what, say, the wheat from the chaff, etc. But the more you go on, when especially you're autonomous and older, the more you come back on the older concept, that you realize that they were actually spot on, that most of this sort of current age attitude that had its peak, I would say late enough, some few decades ago, to still bring major damage, and having been mounting before, is the let's say the sense of something cannot be generalized, even though somebody has been there and has seen how the thing is and can give you that sort of approach. So if something is not contemplating every single possibility, cannot be categorized in the first place, right? Categories are important conceptually. I was talking, say, about them, also about structuralism before. intending that structuralism tends there to let's say to get down mostly to socioeconomical, deterministic, materialistic approaches, and so that becomes a category that, of course, in itself is wrong, and so there is always a risk in categorizing. But if, say, you are wondering whether, I don't know, chivalric ideology existed, and you want to know why it existed, this is a very tough time in history to find the actual info, unless you look at older historiography and you realize on the basis of the saying that in spite of certain approximation, of certain bias, of certain especially incomplete research in certain fields, the essentials were actually correct, right? And today we have completely bypassed them because it seems like, oh no, that thing is too old, you don't even cite that, right? You don't even those were so ideologues that believed something. Well, okay, but within their own ideologies, there were still very valuable pieces of information you should be reading and appreciating. So, given that material, for example, is all public access, you can find it very easily from the 19th or 20th century. Well, go read that stuff, right? It's not necessarily going to be, the finest. There are some mistakes. Of course, historiography improved, but much of what is said there was not repeated, even though correctly, in later times, and has been distorted in certain different ideological ways that, we understand historically, but that if we do not have the the intellectual antibodies to, especially as beginners, it can be really confusing, and we could exchange that for, oh my god, that guy said that, so it must be true. And factually, how many guys works, right? Because if one starts reading, like, again, without this sort of more solid systemic medieval history background, the one that, say, you could get at university, at least studying properly the, say, good enough manuals, what is, even if you read 3 books from an author, that gives you the actual awareness whether that author is correct or not, until you start reading other authors, right, and going with them, right. There are ways and ways, of course, of approaching medieval history. As I was saying at the beginning, say, finding an expert in everything is impossible, so you must forcefully study different books at different times, and on different topics, on different places, eras, and that is something you must forcefully just do alone, right? When I began university, for example, they made us study Bloch, Pirenne, just for the sake of knowing who they were, right, and what they wrote. And I think that starting from those, even though there are severe problems about both, and I never made a video about Marc Bloch, but say, hell, a historian, I talk about him in that video about Cantor, right? That that makes you see things in perspective, right? I disagree fundamentally with Bloch's philosophy of history, but of course I would never let, because I'm on the other side, but I would never let somebody like Cantor saying, those guys were just, I don't know, biased, they weren't really real historians, and then this guy writing like in a comic book about things that he has never even evidently opened a book on, like what he said about Longbirds, because I was posed specifically a question about him regarding to that topic, and you realize how easily, let's say, even Cantor is a name that you have heard sometimes, normally, if you are interested in medieval history, and maybe you have heard more of him because he was more like, in, say, Anglosphere, a random guy would acquire some notoriety than the actual work of individuals like Bloch, right? Going to certain specific threads that I love particularly, I think one of my favorite authors. Again, I'm not a follower by nature, and so I just have always my different ideas and so on. But Kantorowicz's work, I think, is really necessary. Frederick II and The King's Two Bodies, I think, are some of those reads that really change your mind consistently, right? Read first, for example, Abulafia's Frederick II, and then read Kantorowicz's Frederick II. That blows your mind. That makes you understand what it means to be a historian with balls, and realizing that this does not exist anymore practically. Look at Kantorowicz, all his history, his personal life. I don't need to digress on him, but if you know his background and you read what he wrote, considering the historical context in which he did so, you start understanding that history is not just, and it's never especially, a matter of, again, the sculpted, engraved, fixed notion that you can afford to simply cite, right? And that history is a living being, right? And it still has a hierarchy, still has a quality. It still has, let's say, it's an activity. It's a human activity, right? So it is embodied by these historians that write these extraordinary works, but it's what it allows you to learn about history that automatically, like after you read Kantorowicz's Frederick II, your life cannot be the same anymore, right? And that's the thing that really makes it that's why I dislike Bloch, for example, because you read those books and you yawn at that, right? Even if they are interesting to some degree, but they're heavy to read, they are sort of boring. They take certain too much theoretical, when not abstract, categories, and starting from moral and scientific ground that you can legitimately say what the hell is that in the first place. This is not to say that, I don't know, a work like Kantorowicz doesn't, right? You can't criticize it, but it's the level, the place where this person was, that you start becoming jealous of. Because you really, like today we have computers, the internet, we have a lot of digitalized stuff, you can't get everything whenever you want. These people did so like by handwriting, by memorizing, with the means of the time, and they did like incomparably better and more than today even the most trained historians, the PhDs and so on, really actually do, and professors and so on. So becoming aware a bit also of the oldies, right? It's a bit of a desecrating title in this regard, but truly the fact that the world changed and that you must never think to make the childish mistake of thinking to be a better or a more capable person than those who preceded you, right? Because that's the first indicator of complete historical illiteracy, but by a severe degree, right? And it's very easy to dismiss that, right? It's completely typical of young, uneducated people to presume that they are better than people who live in the past, because they simply say, people did something bad in the past, so they stick to that, and so I don't do that, so I'm better. That's the first indicator of complete, and that's also a complete lack of religious or spiritual education. You immediately understand that, right? One of the best things about history, when you learn it, when you acquire it, when you handle it, when you truly have, you take the reins of it, is that you immediately understand a person's opinion, right? Or the same worldview, right, etc., on the basis of a historical statement, whichever it is. Right? And that's the point where I think, and I hope also the author of the question, or anybody, will get at some point, starting from another point. I don't know which other books that I could recommend as life. I like very much Benjamin Arnold's works. on, say, a political institutional history of Germany. I studied Lombard history a lot too. There are there it's difficult because in the early Middle Ages you have scholars like Chris Wickham that are a bit venerated, etc. And of course he opens really another dimension to you. There are so many. There's all the sort of the Germanistic side of the story, the migration era. Walter Pohl's work is also very good. But even about that, the question is, you must focus on one given topic and entering in the depths of that in order to fully appreciate it. This very often can be done only through proper research, like writing a thesis, especially. You can't quite read those books and say pretending to remember that if you don't work on them specifically. There are certain just pieces I loved. Reinhard Fuchs, for example, which is very interesting, 12th century work, and that it's satirical but also very that has a lot. It has the bestiary sort of characterization. There's a lot of traditionalism. There is this satire against Frederick Barbarossa. A work that, well, of course, if you want to really... There are works that changed my life. For example, the Steirische Reimchronik. That you may say, well, because there is not a translation about that, so at least you should be able to translate from Middle High German. But reading that and understanding the etymology, understanding the figures of speech, understanding the words choices and so on, it's really better than watching any movie that has ever been made, let's say, on the Middle Ages, just by reading that and understanding thoroughly and deeply what they really meant. I will be making some videos about that because I wrote a master thesis on the Battle of Markfeld. In that case, it was necessary to read this stuff. But I think you must read Dante's Comedy. All right, you should appreciate Petrarch's lyrics. You can't quite study the Middle Ages without that. Right, the great classics: Gregory of Tours, Paul the Deacon, Bede the Venerable, Isidore of Seville, as distant as they may seem, and also without guidance, but let's say, especially as a beginner, they leave you with a sort of true love for the people that they were, for the times they lived in, because you understand, first of all, how tough it was, but how certain these people were about the world and reality, unlike us that really live in literally the best time in history, but are completely broken morally and complain about ourselves all the time rather than doing something about it. Chronicles are very interesting to read as well whenever they are especially very famous sources. I advise, especially Italian chronicles are very good, like Villani's one, for example. But those also require, in that case, knowledge of medieval Italian vernacular. But there are Simon of Ketz's, for example, chronicles, also more primitive ones that are very curious, because sometimes you must read sources that you wonder what the hell they even mean, right? And when they were trying, for example, to write history, right, in countries like that point, the 13th century Hungary, and trying to explain the origins of the Hungarian people regarding the relation between the crown, the oligarchs, the ethnic background, how they thought of peoples like the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars. That is a must, in my opinion, that cannot be simply, say, eliminated, because you must grow accustomed with the incoherences of let's say what we think should be coherent, but that for them didn't have to be, because it was of course a political instrument. A very beautiful work this was from my master class in Byzantine history about Manuel I Comnenus, the work of Paul Magdaleno. That is also beautiful. That makes you realize how deeply intertwined the entire Europe and the Mediterranean really were. Like, for a battle won or lost in one place, the entire axis of balance changed. It opens your eyes a bit on the difficulties that we have in actually assessing the those big questions, like why did the Byzantine Empire started to fall apart so quickly? Was it something that had to happen or didn't have to happen? That's quite important and interesting work. If anyone is interested, especially in juridical history, I think you must read Rothery's Edict, right? I think a good manual on history of law is important. These are usually well made, at least where I come from. They say the history of medieval law, from the Theodosian codes, passing through the Germanic ones, the recovery of Roman law, the canon law, the decretals, the various national traditions. I think that also is useful, especially to understand the actual functionment of medieval government, not because they talk to you about how countries were practically administrated, but through the juridical culture you understand what were truly the limits of the state, right? And before the state, in many ways, or whatever you want to term by that. So that on my channel, you know that I often cover the history of law, because if you pick just an average manual, right, about written by some structuralists, they will start circling around the problem. You will say there were complex relations between the various power groups and the social dynamics, and they don't tell you anything about that. Evenemential history is a bit of a tougher nut to crack. Of course, there are biographies, especially if you're interested in countries like England, France, Castile, or wherever there was a sort of stable monarch. We were talking about the Byzantine Empire or Sicily, or all these, say, places where you have a king, actually, or an emperor, or whatever, and they succeeded one another. And even if the history is particularly messed up, still there is a continuity in that regard. You can, yes, pick that biography on that single king, and you say, oh, well, I learned about, I don't know, what did we talk about recently? Alfonso X of Castile, Edward I of England. And then you go by that, but at the same time you don't know much about the other authors. And of course there are books about basically all the kings that ruled, at least these major ones in late medieval times. But aside from the fact that some works are better than others, and there is always a consistent bias regarding anything, but about historical figures, I would say, especially in the Anglosphere, with the concept of tyranny and sort of distrust towards more concentrated authority, you always get some strange attitudes from everywhere. Like, it's not to say that you will not find this in other countries, but it can be useful at that point to literally pick even something very basic. If you need the actual evenemential history of everything, that's tough, right? Because at least if you pick, I don't know, the Kingdom of England, it's very easy to pick even Wikipedia and sort of find the information that you need. But if you start saying, I don't know, German history or Italian history, in these countries where also everything is particularly fragmented, but not necessarily less important or powerful, as a matter of fact, well, at that point you really are in trouble, because there isn't really a comprehensive history of that, right? Unless you dig back again into the mid-20th century or before, where you can find a bit of local history, a bit of say monographies about, say, I don't know, the history of that city, for example, or yes, what happened. There are beautiful, as I was saying before, right, from the first half or the mid 20th century, you have magnificent biographies, some of which about great rulers. For example, I don't know, Robert of Anjou of Naples. That there are, I forgot the name of the author, but it's a French guy. Well, okay, well, this is not so important, but to say you read that, right, and you have, especially in the bibliography, everything. In which archives you can go dig. You have entire documents really reported in the book. They're massive volumes, right, of hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they're very comprehensive. For example, David's own History of Florence, for example, or Finca's Acta Aragonensia. You'd say, well, the Acta Aragonensia, these are actual acts, right, of the King of Aragon, about really lots of stuff going on all over Europe. And you say, well, why should I read this stuff in Latin or Catalan of the time, or in some other, I don't know, hybrid, by the way, because Middle Latin is also something fascinating to translate. It's not like when you're well trained in, say, in classical Latin, right? And that is, of course, mandatory to some degree, because through that there are you find situations, right, that are real, right? This is not just reading a piece of literature, like, I don't know, you read Boccaccio's novels, and so or Chaucer's tales, and you are able to picture some funny, witty, savory, again, ideas these people had fun with. There you find what actually was happening at the time, through which context, and very often, at times, we know just that thing about that one guy once, but that told you, I don't know, which was the most powerful family in that city while they were making war to another. And depending on who wanted to know that, you have substantially the idea of how interested and they were into other countries' politics, because they simply had to rely on that in order to make their own move. And it's at that point that the Middle Ages sort of starts taking a new face and aspect, right? Then, of course, there are different other, say, things you can read. I don't know. Mère Vigueur. It's a very good author. I really advise him. Mallet. It's not that they didn't make mistakes, right? Or that they always quote everything perfect. Because you see, that's the other thing that triggers me when people ask for sources. But have you ever actually, like, if there's a very famous scholar revered with like hundreds of publications in his life, that's big shots, do you think that actually everything they write is fully substantiated? Because until you make serious research, and you need to know, for example, where did a guy get an information from, because you realize that you missed that, and so there must be another study or another source. Sometimes you actually find what kind of thing they quoted, something very obscure, very strange. You actually read the work, and it does not say what what they wrote before citing it. This does happen, right? Regarding citations, I don't know, a guy like Mallet could say things, but publishing work without well, he's dead, of course, but I mean, speaking of present tense, but the point I was making is that great name, famous guy, does he actually cite everything he's referring to specifically? No. You understand, this is typical also a bit of the Anglosphere. They tend to refer to a broader work and say you'll find more or less the information there. But I want to know what kind of information you found, what you were actually referring to. And it's not that there is ways and ways of doing that, right? Some obviously do very, very thoroughly, very precisely, but this is for saying that big names that also sell very, say, famous disclosure books with some degree of important research, but very often are not really the authority that you can easily quote and or cite with the certainty that they are telling you exactly, that you can rely on them exactly. Also because if you're just reading a book, let's be honest, you're not going even to go read that, right? I don't know people that actually buy books and realize that they have both, not just the book, but the entire bibliography of the same. They're not going to read it. Some are not even going to read the notes, right? So that's what, again, makes me severely distrust all this need for sort of witch hunt, or where do you find this information from. I know where I find this information from. Go to see how historiography fundamentally looks at this stuff, right? And how they substantially operate. Because when I write an article, a book, whatever, I'm the kind of guy that cites every single damn thing, right? And you know what's the worst about that is that sometimes you don't want to know what kind of works you use, right? Because you have reliable info, right? But in theory, you should cite the single most, say, just to make an example. Let's see. There are some compendia, right, of, say, battles, sort of military style, so on. And these are second-hand, say, historiography works, meaning that they actually use other studies, not necessarily the primary sources, which means that if they say something, they're fairly reliable. Sometimes they're even more reliable than actual sort of, more titled references. But they in fact get it from another study that you're sure is saying that, but that you're not going to read specifically. And so there you have a problem, because you want to have that quick access to information, but you don't want to tell other people where you get this immediate information from, because they're going to complain that it's not going to be the actual primary source, for which you have to make really a lot of other work, right? And it's a way to a bit unload responsibility, but it's perfectly coherent, scientific, and moral, as long as, of course, the information is correct, which is something that you should know anyway, you're responsible for. But, again, concretely and being honest, most people do not even understand what that citing mechanism works like in practice, and especially when you're writing a work, right? There was surely a point I was making, I forgot, but if you're banally interested just in warfare, like that video about the medieval Western Balkans, etc., well, at that point you can find stuff also more easily, right? Or at least you can find stuff like, I don't know, even the Ospreys, or the, what's that other series? I mean, it's not like Ospreys, but it's, wait a second, going to check that out. I mean, there are different collections that you can use to, I forgot the name here, it's not important, it should be something about, okay, it's full of them. There's Century of the Warriors. They're all very different. I'm quoting random stuff, but if you really need, right, the spot on sort of precise reference, etc., with a decent bibliographical background, you can use even that, right, without descending into heavy books. The point is also, how do you find that? Because this stuff is not to be found for free on the internet anymore, which means that you have to buy the books, and again, in that sphere, there is not the medieval, say, history book as a whole, like in the question, that can solve your problem. The best way to go with history is to really study it, hopefully, right, just going to university, and at that point obliging yourself in the process to pass exams and to write, especially to write thesis, and hopefully the PhD is the best thing, because until that point, it's not that you really, even with a bachelor or a master, you really learn how to work well, right? You may even do so in a methodological sense, especially you can learn about, again, citations and stuff, but you will not have necessarily filled the gaps of your knowledge to the point that you're able to see the greater aspect behind a historical issue, right? So that's quite a problem in practice. What else one could read? Well, really anything, right? It depends on what you are personally interested in. It's about, in my opinion, being thorough. It's about trying to get the essential picture from a political, military, and social point of view at the same time, right? I'm not a fan of biographies per se, right? That's seemingly very. It's either that or the disclosure books of the war in the Middle Ages, or war in medieval England, or this kind of stuff. That can be an introduction, can be sort of a pastime, can be a way you start approaching the topic, but it's not going to be enough, you know. At some point, when you want to know the serious questions, especially the more you get into history, if you are really driven by that, you need to step further towards something that must forcefully pass through that sort of academic completion, and then coming back to the specific sort of topic that you want to deepen. Because that's what history is. It's the inquiry itself. So it's not a mere, okay, well, I want to know randomly what this thing was like, right? I never used the most advanced AI chats, but they seem to be extremely unreliable so far, right? They have really, they don't understand history. They're stupid, like old machines are fundamentally. They don't really realize what they're telling you, right? And everything could sound nice and convincing, because let's be honest, at this point, AI is just an advanced way of Google Translator. You just tell them what you wanna write in a decent English, and they harmonize the language. But in terms of information, it's terrible, to say the least. They may even surprise you as far as how you can have a conversation about a certain topic, but you understand their limits, and after you understand that, you're not interested in talking with them anymore, right? So I honestly am skeptical about the fact that history can simply be learned through such means, or that we will not need to do so because we're going to have AI. I think it's actually an enormous mistake. Actually, I'm more thrilled now as a historian to witness the collapse of any other kind of historical expertise, in if this helps evaluating further mine right on the market. And I think we will. I already see it, honestly, from YouTube, that there is this sort of, I don't believe that this is not AI, for example, kind of attitude, because apparently the idea that somebody can have spent his life studying history is something just does not exist aptitudinally anymore. And I still think about Kantorovitz and what he managed to write back in the day without any digital auxilium. And I see kids now just like, I don't know, only 10 years younger than me, that literally have been cancelled from their brains the mere possibility that somebody can learn and store information and having a critical skill or inquiry capacity, right? So that is, in my opinion, yet another very interesting. So I try to keep my content engaging as far as this specific aspect of criticism is concerned. Like, I'm particularly interested in rendering people aware of their own potential, right? That is much greater than what one of any machine can be, and I'm serious, because it's not the same thing. A machine can even do what millions of humans can do, but that's something that humans can even have the possibility of using, or that have even the need of using, right? It's okay. I made a video about AI. I told what I think about it, but it's not that I'm pessimistic about the usefulness of AI, also historically, but I just think that it's still a profoundly different thing from, say, actual intelligence, first of all, but secondly, it's really about the way sources are inserted, so, or used by the machine. That is the problem, and we do not have at this point any of the technology to provide AI with the actual information that is enough to make it reliable, right? We cannot simulate an actual intelligence, and these things are not going to become more intelligent than us. It's going to be more powerful than us. I mean, lots of things in the world really are. So it's not this one that should, at least as far as this branch concern us, more than match, right? It's the general effects on the world that are sort of more concerning, and it's about the moral collapse of human beings, which is actually another, yet the other issue. And this is what I really mean with history. But whenever I answer these questions, I always feel sort of guilty, because I must say I do feel every day a bit of, to say the least, of existential torment regarding how do you tell people that we are in deep trouble in general for moral reasons, right? You can't quite simply go tell a person, well, read these books. And Cassell, this was the publishing house. If you're interested in sort of basic chunks of history of warfare, read that. It's good. Some are, say, better, some are worse. It's just like Osprey, it's a very different type of thing, but that's what I mean, right? If you start appreciating these books only when you're going for a very specific type of information that you want to know, right? And we all know that at this point we can sort of find that information even through the internet, in part even through the same books, but nobody is buying books anymore, or at least doing so, just for finding out the damn information. Well, as historians, believe me, you have to make really equilibristic maneuvers to get information. Fortunately, we have support from libraries, etc. But you can't always have everything, and there you must make a choice also about what you want to learn and why. So this gets always down to the actual thing. What is your motivation? What is your goal? What is your objective? You see here, this question, of course, doesn't say that. It's wondering about that. It's saying, well, it's we'll see about that, right? Where you go from there. Well, if you had say expressed like where you would like to go with that, well, I could provide also with a sort of more concrete, practical information. But that's also why I make a bit of this brainstorming to concretely show how sort of more complex than it seems everything really is, right? At this point, I think I saved myself because having become a historian, I have to work with history, and I have developed my own interests, right? So whatever I learned, at the end of the day, this helps my general work, right? But whenever I find this questions like, I am presumably not an expert or particularly, into history, etc., and when I want to answering this becomes also a matter of personal responsibility, because you must, from one side, convince people that of course it's worth to study history, to learn history for what it can give you, but at the same time you know that you can't say, you have to be realistic about not everybody having even the possibility of going too far with that, right? Because of time, because you have a job, you have lots of other things going on, and you can't quite prioritize history just per se, right? But I personally think that history has this sort of salvific role, right? I'm definitely a very, it's not that I'm, well, I've reevaluated humanism and Renaissance, at least when one digs into the actual meaning of the saying rather than the ones we've been told. But that's my favorite sort of life. It was a sort of courtier book that is paid just to research and thinking, not thinking about the collapse of late medieval crisis going on right in the meanwhile, and trying to maintain standards high, but also being aware that what is going on in the world is definitely at least worrying, and we can't quite simply have it all, right? And I'm getting ever more question and answer videos, and I don't want to turn the channel into that, right? But as far as I can, I think that speaking clearly about the objective of history is also again a way to change yourself, a way to improve your life condition. And of course, in a moment of crisis, generalized one, right? Again, you could live we live in very good times after all, but crises are measured from a moral point of view, right? Not necessarily the material one that usually accompanies them, but it's not all, right? At least it can be the cause, primarily, of what is going to happen later. But let's say a more it has the idea of being considered an intellectual by some degree. I think that I study history because I'm a much more fact-based person. Like, I like to solve problems, I like to make things work, right? So to me, whenever I talk history, it's to provide with an explanation that makes sense, right? Not just to provoke someone, right? At least with these more theoretical videos, I do provoke or feed thoughts and so on. But whenever I explain something historically, I like it to make sense, right? Not to be just a sort of, look at this thing, it's strange or weird, because also YouTube has become that, right? I don't know how much people really read. As a historian personally, I read a lot in the sense that every day, yes, I get new information and elaborate it and so on, but I must say that as a historian, you don't really read that often entire lengthy books just for the pleasure of that, even though you're learning history all the time. Why? Because, again, reading a book just for the curiosity of knowing something historical, something different from making a concrete research. It's just completely different levels of application. It can even be a simple research. It can be the one I make for, I don't know, a single video. But it's still going to be something different. It's something you must process, you must use to truly explain, right, to make sense of, and to be really ready to defend, right? And you have to be sure, of course, of what you say too. So it always takes the time it deserves, and it is a challenge. So I'm not completely, in order to talk about the purpose and the motivation to study something of this kind, one should always talk more about their own background, talk more about their own lives, talking more about their own problems, right? And history is the vehicle to finding those answers. Because as I was saying in the beginning, for example, it doesn't make any sense to say study medieval history. Somebody has a prejudice against religion, for example. And of course, people have, also religious people have prejudices towards religion, meaning that, of course, they may be part of they may think that one religion is correct, or another has more problems, to say the least, or that there is, let's say, a dimension sometimes that even stops to what they personally do, and that doesn't require further research. And I think that history helps dramatically to widen the horizon of awareness, not to make moral relativism, but to actually help fixing exactly the most, say, concrete issues, so that you can navigate yourself through the same history with the confidence of someone who knows what is going on. And with Schwerpunkt, I must tell you, it's a mystery as well what I'm doing here, because I also have my trouble. Actually, from a couple of weeks, lots of things turned upside down. I will hopefully keep making videos, because that's what I want to do anyway, but let me tell you, sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes you really look at yourself and say, well, you have lots of things to do, etc., but is this worth it? It is. It may be even therapeutic to some degree, right, of speaking this way and explaining these things, but it is somehow, and it must be, let's say, the discipline of it, right? The sense of, like, continuity, right? Seeing the objective down the line, right? That's something which really inspires you. It's about finding motivation, after all. I think that's what history is. It's let's find out more, because the more we find out, the more the world makes sense. I think that's fundamentally the most important aspect of this historical notion. It's not about knowing what that guy did or when. Yes, as I said, dates and names are crucial, but I mean, next to that, outside even of, when you close the book, you have a life to live outside, right? And that is the one that we're all trying to fix concretely. And honestly, I don't see the world, say, providing with answers. Like we would even know what these answers should be, but we do not essentially have the courage, of saying that, right, or taking that stand that can make the difference. Right, and it's difficult sometimes because we lose ourselves into these uncertainties. We fundamentally remain stuck to certain preconceived notions, and we do not suspect that we could simply live better by knowing more and being more powerful, just per se. Okay, but this video is really deliberating now from the original purpose. I see here it's the weekend, there are lots of new questions, and again, today I hope tomorrow to finally upload the video about the Merovingians that had started today, but we will have time in this regard. In any case, for today, well, I stop here unless the reason this was a quite simple question. I gave a bunch of titles, etc., and again, I could give more, but the simple answer is you should be choosing your own work yourself. That there is no such thing like a book which solves the problem. You shouldn't overstep by pretending that you can't simply understand a certain period or topic or etc. without having first framed the entire Middle Ages in a decent way, which I think reading multiple manuals could help. Right, I noticed this, that in order to understand how even easily you can sort of manipulate history, or at least inclining someone, right, the reader, towards an interpretation or another, read multiple basic, say, university, medieval history courses, classes, and realize what different cut is present in bias is present in all of them, right? Whether how they talk about this given topic or another, right? I always recommend, again, a political history first of all, also a military one, right? But realizing that history is about the decision, is about the making, is about the objective, right? This is universal, right? It's not about thinking that it's all about economics or social issues, right? It's the whole, but there is a precise category. Politics, war, society, they're all acting together, right? But they all have a relation with one another, which is to be understood comprehensively, right, and not just by sectorializing the topic. What else? I just has this my explanations, because I think they're always sort of vague in a way, but it can be that kind of order of ideas, right? For today, I think we can stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.